There were fireworks at the White House today out of a meeting on Syria after they say the president Democrats said the president insulted House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, calling her a third-rate politician to her face. Pelosi portrayed the president's behavior as a meltdown.
Earlier today, the House of Representatives voted, what? 354 to 60 in opposition to the actions that he has taken in Syria. He was shaken up by it.
We have to pray for his health because this was a very serious meltdown on the part of the president.
The president came in, to my observation, angry and defensive. And frankly, it got worse from there.
He was insulting, particularly to the speaker. She kept her cool completely. But he called her a third-rate politician.
Which I said, I wish you were a politician, Mr. President.
I think it's a very sad commentary on the President of the United States.
Now, NBC News reports that during the meeting, the president suggested there were communists in Syria and said that Democrats would like that. He also went after his former defense secretary, Jim Mattis, for his comments that ISIS would resurge if the U.S. fails to keep pressure on it. Trump called Mattis, quote, the world's most overrated general. White House responded to the Democrats' portrayal of the meeting, saying in a statement that, quote, the president was measured, factual, and decisive in the meeting. I'm joined now by Jonathan Lemire, White House reporter for the Associated Press, and Charlie Sykes, editor-at-large for The Bulwark. Jonathan Lemire, let me just start with you. This meeting, let's just sort of set the scene here. Pelosi, Schumer, Hoyer, we saw them. There were some other Democrats there meeting with the White House. The subject here was Syria, was foreign policy, and what happened?
Well, we've now had a few rather eventful meetings between the president and Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer at the White House. Some have ended rather abruptly, like this one. Yes, you're right. The topic was Syria, but as they got in there, the president started bitterly complaining about the impeachment proceedings. And I think that is something that has really come to light here in recent weeks. We've seen the president's rage on this topic as the impeachment inquiry has begun. You know, there is a political calculation here being made by the White House and Republicans close to the president that they think impeachment could be a winner for him. They think that, you know, the public doesn't want this, although we are seeing, of course, polls trending in the other direction. But they've a long belief for months now that the public didn't want this, that the president could play the martyr card, that, you know, if they push this into 2020, they could paint it as purely political and partisan. However, the president himself was not into that idea. He has to understand the political calculus behind it, but he's been very uncomfortable with the idea of being impeached. He's told people around him he fears, even if the Senate doesn't remove him, that it would be the first line of his political obituary, that he was the third president to be impeached. And he feels anxious about the whole thing, and we're seeing that anger burst out in recent days. And it did today, of course, with Speaker Pelosi. And the White House now has even put out a photo of them gathered around the meeting with Pelosi standing up, sort of gesturing at the president. And the president put it out, suggesting that it makes her perhaps look weak or rude to the commander-in-chief in the White House. But if you look at the picture more carefully, you'll see that everyone around the president has their heads down and bowed, and that Pelosi perhaps looks like a command position of strength. And the Democrats walked out of the meeting soon thereafter.
And Charlie Sykes, we mentioned too there, the president's comments, reportedly the president's comments about Jim Mattis. And you can think back a couple years ago, obviously brought him into his cabinet. Trump did. Trump used to celebrate him at public events, talk about him as Mad Dog. He seemed to love that nickname. From that reverence to what he's saying today, what do you make of it?
Well, first of all, it's going to be a really long year, isn't it? Look, this president has been petty and petulant before, but you really got the sense, as Jonathan described, that he's also rattled by this. This did not seem to be the performance of a confident man, but also his willingness to insult men like General Mattis. I think it carries some risk for him because one of his strongest constituencies has been the military, right? He wants to bond himself to the military. And you talk to anybody in the military or national security, and they have the utmost respect for Jim Mattis. And Jim Mattis has been very restrained and very reluctant to speak out until now. But again, here's a president who is acting out of glandular impulse, making decisions of life or death, while clearly ignoring and now insulting his own generals. It's got to be one of those. It's a moment where, again, perhaps we're not learning anything new about who Donald Trump is, but it certainly underlines it in a very dramatic way.
In northern Syria, the fighting raged on between Turkish-backed forces and the Kurds, once U.S. allies in the fight against the Islamic State. now terrorists themselves, according to Donald Trump.
Now, the PKK, which is a part of the Kurds, as you know, is probably worse at terror and more of a terrorist threat in many ways than ISIS.
Trump today seemingly washed his hands of events that he himself helped set in motion.
I'm not going to get involved in a war between Turkey and Syria, especially when, if you look at the Kurds, and again, I say this with great respect, they're no angels.
Trump spun his decision as fulfilling a campaign promise to bring soldiers home and stop endless wars.
Sounds very much like a Russian talking point.
But this former Turkish politician points out those 28 U.S. soldiers were keeping the peace.
Of all of Washington's involvements in the Middle East, this one had the smallest footprint. It cost the least, and it was the most effective.
Now, even Republicans are critical.
We're about to destroy the best ally we've had on the ground in the fight against ISIS. That would be a dishonorable act.
The yeas are 354.
In the House of Representatives, more than 120 Republicans joined Democrats in condemning Trump's actions.
He was shaken up by it.
Later, Democrats said they walked out of a face-to-face with Trump, calling him insulting, with no plan to deal with the mess he created.
The witness on the part of the president was a meltdown. Sad to say.
Trump responded with a flurry of tweets, not about policy, but accusing the Democrats of having an unhinged meltdown. Stephen D'Souza, CBC News, New York.
Just into our newsroom, this is coming from Washington, where U.S. President Donald Trump is speaking in the Oval Office. He is commenting on the situation in Syria. Let's listen in here on CBC News Network.
But Mike is leaving. Mike Pompeo will be meeting also, who's here right now with us, and he's going to be joining the meeting. We have a lot of great people over there, we'll see. In the meantime, our soldiers are not in harm's way, as they shouldn't be, as two countries fight over land. That has nothing to do with us. And the Kurds are much safer right now, but the Kurds know how to fight. And as I said, they're not angels. They're not angels. If you take a look, you have to go back and take a look. But they fought with us. We paid a lot of money for them to fight with us, and that's okay. They did well when they fought with us. They didn't do so well when they didn't fight with us. When I refused to allow the Americans a year and a half ago to fight with the Kurds against Iraq, I said, wait a minute, this country stupidly just spent a fortune on fighting for, with, around Iraq. Nobody knows how they spent it, but they spent, actually, we're in the Middle East now for $8 trillion, if you can believe that stupidity. But in Iraq, we're in for probably $5.5 trillion. So they're telling me, wait a minute, we just spent $5.5 trillion fighting in Iraq and with Iraq, and now we're supposed to spend money to fight with the Kurds against Iraq. I said, no, thank you. So what happens is when I said we're not going to fight with the Kurds left. They didn't want to fight against Iraq, which right now isn't the greatest fighting force in the world. That happened twice. The Kurds actually are pulling back substantially from Turkey, and Syria is pulling in. Syria probably will have a partner of Russia, whoever they may have. I wish them all a lot of luck. You know, Russia was involved in Afghanistan. It used to be called the Soviet Union. Now it's called Russia for a reason, because they lost so much money in Afghanistan that they had to downsize, a very big downsizing. So if Russia wants to get involved with Syria, that's really up to them. They have a problem with Turkey. They have a problem at a border. It's not our border. We shouldn't be losing lives over it. But again, we only had 28 soldiers. It was 26, 28. I got all different numbers. It ends up being 28. Between the 26, 28, two people, and they're fully accounted for.
This was Donald Trump in the Oval Office talking about the U.S. stance and with the situation in Syria. You have to wonder, though, where does this leave U.S. diplomats? Donald Trump still says Secretary of State Mike Pompeo expects to meet Turkey's president face-to-face. Pompeo and U.S. Vice President Mike Pence are traveling to Turkey for a possible meeting tomorrow with Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So far, Turkey is refusing the latest pleas to end the fighting in Syria, and the Turkish president is giving Kurds a new ultimatum. Intense fighting rages in a strategic city the Turks claimed to have captured days ago. Turkey is trying to drive Kurdish forces from a 30-kilometer wide zone in northern Syria. Erdogan says the onslaught will continue unless the Kurds pull out of the zone by tonight. The United Nations warns the humanitarian crisis is growing as the fighting intensifies. We've got freelance journalist Rebecca Collard in Beirut. She has more on international efforts to end the violence.
We've had for days calls from international organizations, from European powers, and of course, and probably most significantly, from the U.S., for this Turkish offensive in northern Syria to stop. The U.S. has called for a ceasefire. It has threatened sanctions, put trade deal talks on hold in an effort to pressure the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, into stopping this offensive in northern Syria. Now we know that Vice President Mike Pence and the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo are going to head to Turkey, and they're hoping to meet with the Turkish president to discuss this offensive. Now, we're hearing conflicting reports, as you said, Suhana, about whether or not this meeting will take place. We've seen comments to both effects from the Turkish leadership, and it may be that instead of a meeting with Erdogan, what they're going to get is a meeting with their diplomatic counterparts. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens on that front. But I think what this is pointing to is a much bigger picture change in Syria, Suhana, and something we've been talking about for the last few days. The U.S. has pulled its troops out of Syria. And now in those places where those U.S. troops used to be, we have Syrian fighters and we have Russia. And essentially with that troop movement, with those U.S. troops leaving Syria, so has the U.S.'s influence. And that is not to say, Suhana, that the U.S. does not have influence in the Middle East at all anymore, that they don't have influence on Turkey. Of course, Turkey is a NATO partner. They're a trade partner for the U.S. But I think what we're seeing and what we're seeing in these developments is that the U.S.'s influence in Syria is definitely declined significantly. And because of that, we don't even know whether or not these top U.S. officials are going to get a meeting with the Turkish president, Suhana.
I know you'll be watching to see what comes out of any meeting. If it happens, so will we. Now, I want to move on to the United Nations raising those grave humanitarian concerns. Rebecca, what are you hearing on that front?
I mean, we're talking about, we've seen really varied estimates about how many people have been displaced by this fighting, Suhana, in the last just over a week. The Kurdish-led administration in northern Syria has put the number close to 300,000 people. We've seen UN figures much less than that, closer to around 160,000. But I'll tell you something, having talked to aid organizations that are working on the ground, they're of course concerned about the displaced people and about where they will go, because we know that there's restrictions as far as entering Iraq at the moment, that it's been difficult for these families to actually enter to Iraq. That border is not wide open. But the other thing is that they are increasingly concerned about being able to access people that are displaced inside Syria. So, you know, because of the fighting, obviously it's difficult for humanitarian organizations to act, and we've heard of some of them actually leaving. But the last thing I would say, Suhana, and I think this is something that we've seen and I've heard from humanitarian organizations throughout the Syrian conflict, that this situation where there's a transfer of authority from the Syrian Kurds, backed by the U.S., to very quickly we have Syrian government troops coming in, backed by Russia. In this situation where we have a transfer, a very quick shift of authority, this is a dangerous situation for humanitarian actors to act in. And because of that, the people there are at even greater risk, Suhana.
That's freelance journalist Rebecca Collard in Beirut.
You mentioned, too, John, your sense of Trump's frustration just at the presence of the impeachment inquiry, that it was him versus Pelosi in that meeting today. Does that say anything? Because I can remember in sort of the first couple years of his presidency, it wasn't that he was friendly with Pelosi, but he seemed to be less hostile to her. Maybe Is that a fair way of saying it than some other folks? And that's changed dramatically.
He respected her. He told people around him that he thought that she was a good politician, not a third-rate politician. That he did think that when she assumed the speakership, that they'd be able to work out some things. They'd be able to make some deals. That, of course, has not really come to pass, as they've had developed a very adversarial relationship, goaded on by some of the investigations this year, with the Democrats launching probe after probe and the White House stonewalling them at every turn. And now, of course, the impeachment inquiry, which has really changed things. And I think the fact that this explosion happened at a Syria meeting is not a coincidence either, because it's that topic is one of the very few where Republican senators have been very vocal about breaking with him, including some of his staunchest allies like Lindsey Graham. And while still unlikely that enough Republican senators would defy the GOP rank and file, who find the president still very popular, his polling with them, as you well know, is very high. But if he is impeached, it will be the Republican senators who have his fate in their hands. They're the ones who would vote in a trial to remove him from office. And I think there's a sense as well that the Syria thing has really, the president's just simply not used to taking criticism from all sides, including those Republicans in the Senate who normally have stood by him.
And that's another element here. The House had just voted against his Syria policy, with a lot of Republicans crossing over right before that meeting. Also, Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican majority leader, he was in the White House meeting as well. He just told reporters, quote, "I didn't have anything to say in the meeting, and I don't have anything to say about it now." Yeah, Charlie, what is your sense, too? Just Jonathan brings up how Republican senators are reading Trump right now, how they're looking at him. What's your sense of what they're seeing and how they're processing it?
Well, it can't be enhancing their confidence in the commander-in-chief. And I think one of the things that is frustrating President Trump is he's used to being able to dictate events, right? He's used to being able to dictate the news cycle. And this is an incident, and right now what we're seeing in Syria, where it's clearly out of his control. He does not actually control the messaging the way that he would like. And, among the, it's not just Republicans in the Senate who are looking at this, and even members of the House who are willing to vote against him. But there are some significant constituencies out there, including evangelical Christians, who have been very, very hostile. I thought it was very interesting that Lindsey Graham went on Pat Robertson's show on CBN on the 700 Club and compared Donald Trump to Barack Obama, said he was pursuing an Elizabeth Warren foreign policy. In the world of Republican conservative politics, this is firing real bullets, because this is the first time that I can remember that you have seen the president willing to alienate conservative Christian voters as part of his base. So he's got more political problems than I think that he's willing to admit at the moment.
All right, Charlie.